So in this lesson, we're going to be discussing how to import data into R. So often we'll have something called a data frame in R, and your clinical data that you'll have in an Excel sheet or a CSV or a text file will be read into R and stored in this data frame. So data frames are very useful for storing clinical information, such as you would have in your metadata file. And the reason for this is that you can store different types of data. So we've discussed different data types in R, including numeric, character, and logical. And all a data frame is basically a vertical collection of lists, where each list is a vector. So each list would have one data type, but you could have a collection of different data types in one data frame. So often the data we'll work with, your rows will represent patients. So say here we're working with patient number 1, and these are clinical characteristics maybe specific to this patient. And you could also have logical and numeric. So a data frame is a list of vectors of equal length. And as we mentioned, the clinical data, each row will represent one sample, and variables of interest will be your columns. And then we have certain functions that we can use to examine this data frame, and we'll have a look in RStudio and see how we can do that. So firstly, if we go to our datacarpentry.org material, we'll look at what we want to get from this lesson. So firstly, we're going to learn how to load external data as a CSV file into a data frame. And then we're going to try and summarize the contents of this data frame and really see how we can access specific portions of this data that might be relevant to our downstream analysis. So in the survey data here, there's a CSV file that we're going to work with, that we're going to try and import. So to access this file, we're going to use the download.file command, and that will just pull that CSV file for us into R. So previously we downloaded the code handout.r script file. So you can either work with that, or if you prefer, you can make your own clean script and copy and paste from the Data Carpentry's material. To keep things clear, I'm going to start with a new R script. File, new R script, and let's just call it dataframes.r, and that goes into my intro to R working directory. And we'll use this command. To download that file, but just note that here we specify the destination file, and they've had a folder called data, and we don't have that folder. So if we just execute that command, you'll see it tells you no such file or directory, so it couldn't load that data website. So we have to actually change our destination file, and in our case, because we want to download that file to our working directory, we can just say portal_data join.csv and execute that command. You'll see it downloads that file, and here you can see it's in your working directory. We can click on that and say view file, and you see here it shows you the file, but it's CSV format, so it's not very user-friendly at the moment. So to read that CSV data into table format in R, we can use the read.csv command. So in our R script, I'll just copy and paste that and remove the data folder again. And you'll see we've executed that command, and we've assigned it to an object named surveys. So a handy way to examine an object is to use the str or structure. So if we go structure surveys, it'll tell us, okay, this is a data frame, which we've discussed, and it tells me it has 34,786 observations, so that's the number of rows, with 13 variables or columns. So you'll see each of these entries here represents one column. So we have record ID, month, day, year, and different variables of interest, and you'll see some of them are integers, some of them are factors. This is summarized nicely by the str function. If we rather want to look at the actual table, we can use the head command, so head surveys, and that gives us the first 6 rows of our data frame. So now you can see it's in a nicer table format, and you can start seeing what your data actually looks like. So there's a record ID that we saw up here. There's the month, so now you can see the individual data points for each of your samples, and so on. Other useful functions that we can use to examine our surveys data include the nrow function. So nrow surveys will give us the number of rows, so 34,786, and ncol surveys the number of columns. Then dim will give you the number of rows and columns all in one, so that's something you'd use more often than nrow or ncolumns. Another function that I use quite often is col names. It gives you the column names and row names. And currently those are just numbers. So now we know what a data frame is, we know how to import our data into a data frame in R. Next we're going to learn how to subset this data frame to extract specific portions of the data. So firstly, remember that the square brackets is for subsetting, and with vectors we only had one number that we placed inside the square bracket, or maybe a range of numbers, but no comma. So for data frames, because it's a 2-dimensional table, we're going to have a comma to separate our specification of rows and columns. Let's try that in RStudio. So we're going to go surveys 1, 1, and you'll see that gives you the first entry of the first row. So column 1 and row 1. If we just do surveys, 1, then you'll see that actually gives you an entire column, and that's column 1. So if we look again at str surveys, you'll see that was your record ID column. If we wanted to have the first row, then you're going to put the comma last. So square brackets and then 1 and then a comma. So there you can see it's the entire record for this one sample. A good way to remember the difference between accessing columns and rows is to remember comma first for accessing columns. So then, just like we did for vectors, we can also access a range of rows or columns. So maybe we wanted rows 1 to 3 and column 2. Then we would do that. Give us the months for the first 3 participants. Maybe we also wanted a range of columns, maybe column 2 to 5, and we do that. Enter that. So now we've got for the first 3 participants, row 1 to 3, we've got month, day, year, and plot ID, which are columns 2 to 5. And there are other ways to access columns in data frames. So maybe we don't know what number column the variable of interest is, but we know its name. Then we can say, for instance, surveys, and then we use the $sign, and then you'll see R will bring up all the columns for you. So maybe we wanted to know what year that entry was, and you can see that gives the year. So that's really the one you would use most often when working with data frames, is actually the $sign. Another way of doing it is using, again, the name of that column, but putting it in inverted commas, and then you have to add, again, the comma first for columns, just like you would for numeric access. And you'll see that gives us exactly the same thing. The thing that I'd like to mention in terms of subsetting data frames is that you can actually exclude specific columns, just like you would call up maybe column 1. You could also exclude only column 1, by using the minus operator. So I'd go comma -1, and then that would give me my entire data frame minus that first column. So now we start with month as opposed to starting with that record ID column. It's a good idea just to take that surveys object and go play around with it, try and access different columns and rows and subset your data until you're really comfortable with using those different operators. There's also a little challenge section here that you can do in the practical slot. For a quick recap, so regarding data frames, we learned how to load external data from a CSV file into what's called a data frame in R. And for that we use the read.csv function. You can also use the read.table function. And then we learned how to subset this data frame, which is a really valuable skill to have in R that you'll be using all the time. So we use the square brackets for that, and one way to remember which side your columns and your rows are comma first for columns. So your columns are always on the right hand side of your comma. We can also select a range, like this example over here, and we can exclude specific columns by using the minus operator. And there's several ways to select a column. So you can either use the numeric index of that column, or you can call it by name with the inverted commas as well as the comma. Or what I most commonly use is you can use the dollar operator just to call up that specific column. So in the previous lecture, we briefly discussed factors. In the Data Carpentries material, there's some practice sessions on factors. So let's just have a quick look in R, how we deal with factors. So if you remember, a factor in R represents categorical data, and that's something that's really useful for us in downstream analyses. So if we look at this variable called sex that we defined with male and female participants, you'll see it tells us we have two levels. So those are the unique factors that it's extracted from this vector of character names that we gave it here, of female and male. If we just wanted to access the levels of that variable, we can use the levels function. And that gives us the female and male. And if we want to know how many levels there are, sorry about that, we use n levels for our variable. And it tells us that we currently have 2 levels. So you'll see the current order of those levels are first female and then male, and that is because R just sorts them alphabetically. If you wanted to re-level that factor, it is possible, and that's specifically useful sometimes for plotting. So maybe you specifically wanted your male or your female on the left or the right, then we can actually do that, and let's have a look at an example. So if we take our surveys data and we say plot, so that's a generic function in R to plot data, and we say plot surveys $6, it gives us female and male, and this bar over here will be samples for which that information was not available. So if we just assign that one specific column to our variable called sex and look at that, we'll see it has M and F for male and female. And now we'd like to go and try re-level those factors. So if you look at the levels here, you'll see there's one that's blank, and that is actually samples that were undetermined. So to make it more intuitive, let's go and actually do that. So if we look at those levels now, we'll see now we have undetermined F and M.